They put the cuffs on the wrong man, and before this day was over, an entire airport would learn the price of seeing danger where dignity stood. The terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson was alive with the usual rhythm of American travel. Rolling suitcases clicking across polished floors, overhead announcements cutting through the air every few seconds, tired parents balancing carry-ons and coffee, business travelers glued to their phones as if the world might stop spinning if they looked away for even a moment. Under the cold white lights near gate C-18, Marcus Reed stood quietly beside a charging station, one hand resting on the handle of a small black roller bag, the other holding his boarding pass and government ID. He was 38, broad-shouldered, composed, and dressed simply in dark jeans, a navy jacket, and clean boots that looked built for durability, not fashion. There was nothing loud about him, nothing reckless, nothing remotely disruptive. And yet in less than 60 seconds, the entire mood around him would shift from ordinary to unforgettable. It started with a voice raised too quickly and too confidently. A man in an expensive blazer pointed across the waiting area and said his bag was missing. Heads turned. A ripple of suspicion moved through the gate like a draft through an old house. Airline staff exchanged uncertain looks. A nearby airport police officer straightened at once, drawn not by evidence, but by instinct, the dangerous kind of instinct that often arrives dressed as authority. Officer Derek Lawson moved through the crowd with the hard expression of someone who had already decided what had happened before asking a single real question. His gaze landed on Marcus and stayed there, not on the people shouting, not on the seats, not on the overhead bins. On Marcus. "Step away from the bag," he said, loud enough for half the gate to hear. Conversations died in pieces. Marcus looked up slowly, confused but calm. "This is my bag," he said evenly. "I'm waiting to board." But Derek was already closing in, already treating explanation like defiance. The officer asked for identification, then snatched a glance of the crowd as if their attention were proof he was in control. Marcus handed over his documents without argument. He did everything right. He kept his voice low. He kept his hands visible. He did not move suddenly. He did not match the picture growing in Derek's mind. But somehow that made no difference at all. Imagine standing there, in a public terminal, under bright airport lights, with strangers staring as if your skin had become a reason all by itself. Imagine hearing your own name spoken back to you not as a fact, but as suspicion. Marcus had felt that look before. Most black men in America had, in one form or another. The look that says you are not being seen as a person first. The look that reaches for a story before it reaches for the truth. A child near the boarding lane clutched her mother's sleeve and whispered something too soft to hear. Someone lifted a phone and started recording. A gate agent froze with a scanner still in her hand. Marcus remained still, but something heavy passed behind his eyes, something older than this moment, older than this airport, older than the officer now demanding he place both hands where everyone could see them. And when the metal restraints clicked shut around his wrists in front of a crowd that had no idea who he was, the silence that followed felt louder than any shout in the building. The waiting area did not erupt into chaos. That was what made it worse. It settled into something colder, something more familiar to people who had spent their lives watching injustice unfold in public, while everyone nearby pretended they were only seeing procedure. The departure board above gate C-18 kept flipping through flights to Dallas, Phoenix, and San Diego as if nothing had happened. A soft chime sounded overhead. Somewhere behind Marcus, a barista called out an order for a caramel latte. Life in the terminal continued with a kind of practiced indifference, and that indifference pressed down on him more heavily than the restraint around his wrists. Officer Derek Lawson stood half a step behind him, one hand near Marcus's shoulder, posture rigid, face set in the expression of a man who believed the uniform on his body had already answered every question that mattered. Marcus could feel dozens of eyes on him now, some curious, some uncomfortable, some quietly satisfied in the way people sometimes are when the person being humiliated is not them. He kept his breathing slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm had carried him through worse places than an airport terminal, though it struck him, not for the first time, how strange America could be. There were countries where he had moved through darkness with more trust at his back than he felt standing under fluorescent lights in his own homeland. "Sir, I need you to cooperate," Derek said, as though Marcus had done anything but that from the first moment. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. I have cooperated the whole time. My identification is in your hand. My ticket is valid. My bag was tagged at check-in. I am not resisting you. The words were clear, respectful, and steady. They should have calmed the scene. Instead, Derek treated that calm the way some men treat dignity when it comes from the wrong person. As attitude. As a challenge. As something that needed to be pushed down before it could stand too tall. Near the gate desk, Rachel Bennett, the airline supervisor on duty, finally stepped forward. She was in her mid-40s, hair pulled tight, tablet tucked to her chest, the look of a woman caught between policy and conscience. "Officer Lawson," she said carefully, "our team is still trying to verify the complaint. We have not confirmed that this passenger took anything." Derek did not even look at her right away. "The complaint was made. I am handling it." Rachel hesitated. Her eyes moved to Marcus, then to the small black carry-on at his feet, then to the businessman who had first raised the alarm. The man suddenly looked less certain than he had a minute ago. He adjusted his blazer, glanced around, and avoided Marcus's face. That detail did not escape the people recording. Phones were up now in 3 different rows of seats. One young man in a college sweatshirt whispered, "He has not even done anything." But he said it to the person beside him, not to the officer. That was how these moments often worked. Truth arrived in murmurs. Authority arrived at full volume. Marcus lowered his eyes for a second and thought of the folded memorial card in his jacket pocket, the one he had planned to carry to Coronado that evening for a ceremony honoring a teammate who never made it home. He had boarded helicopters in desert heat. He had jumped into black water under moonless skies. He had learned how fear sounded when it was real. This was different. This was smaller, uglier, and somehow more exhausting. Because this kind of moment did not ask whether you were brave. It asked whether you could remain human while someone else worked so hard not to see your humanity at all. Then Rachel's radio crackled. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. She looked at the name on Marcus's boarding pass again, then at the screen in her hand, and the color drained from her face. For 3 long seconds, Rachel Bennett said nothing. She stared at the screen in her hand as though it had rewritten the air around her. Then she looked up at Marcus with a different kind of recognition, not the shallow recognition of a face in a crowd, but the sober kind that comes when a name suddenly carries weight, records, and a truth that should have been checked before anyone laid a hand on another human being. "Officer Lawson," she said, and this time her voice was firmer, stripped of hesitation. "I need you to pause this now." Derek finally turned toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, this is an active security response." Rachel took 1 step closer, lowering her tablet just enough to keep the screen visible only to him. "No," she said, every syllable crisp. "This is a verified passenger with federal contractor clearance, documented travel authorization, and a pre-noted profile in the system because he is flying to a memorial event coordinated with defense contacts in California." The words did not land all at once. They moved through the gate area in fragments, picked up by the people nearest the desk first, then passed in glances, lifted brows, and half-finished whispers. Marcus did not react outwardly. He did not straighten with pride or throw Derek's mistake back at him. He simply stood there in the same stillness he had held from the beginning, his jaw set, his shoulders level, his eyes fixed ahead. But inside him, something old and tired tightened. Because this was the part people always imagined would make everything better. The reveal. The credential. The part where the room suddenly realizes the man they reduced to a threat has a resume they can respect. But Marcus knew better than most that dignity should not need decoration before others agree to recognize it. Derek's expression changed by degrees. First annoyance, then confusion, then the unmistakable strain of a man realizing the ground under his authority was no longer stable. "What kind of clearance?" he asked, too quickly. Rachel did not answer him in the vague language he hoped for. "The kind that should have told you to verify before escalating," she said. Near the second row of seats, the businessman who had reported the missing bag shifted again, then quietly bent to check under the chairs beside him. A second later, he froze. The bag was there, wedged 2 seats over, its leather strap caught beneath a metal armrest where it had slipped unnoticed in the commotion. He looked around as if hoping no one else had seen it, but too many phones were already pointed in his direction. Too many eyes had followed the entire chain of humiliation from beginning to end. He lifted the bag slowly, and in that tiny motion the entire story collapsed. Not just the accusation, but the confidence behind it. Not just the officer's reaction, but the assumptions that had fueled it. A young woman near the charging station let out a stunned breath. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Another voice, sharper now, said, "He never did anything wrong." The truth, once quiet, was getting louder. Rachel's radio crackled again, this time with a request from airport operations confirming they were dispatching senior security oversight to gate C-18 immediately. Derek looked at Marcus, really looked at him for what felt like the first time, and saw not a suspicious traveler, not a problem to control, but a man who had given him every chance to do his job with fairness. Marcus turned his head, just enough to meet his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was calm, low, and impossible to ignore. "If my name had not pulled up in your system," he said, "would you have stopped?" The question hung in the air with a force no badge could push aside. Derek Lawson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Around them, the terminal had shifted again. It was no longer the quiet, uncertain silence of people waiting to see who authority would blame. It was the heavier silence that comes when a crowd realizes it has just witnessed something plainly wrong. The businessman who had started it all stood frozen with his recovered bag in both hands, his face pale and tight. The confidence drained from him so completely that he looked smaller somehow, diminished not by accusation, but by the truth. Rachel Bennett stepped toward Marcus carefully, as though even the space between them now required respect. "Sir," she said, voice low, measured, "I am very sorry." It was the first honest sentence anyone in uniform or airline colors had spoken to him since this started. Marcus looked at her, then at the people recording, then at the great wall of glass beyond the gate where aircraft tails lined up beneath the late afternoon light. He could see the sun dropping toward the horizon in streaks of gold and pale orange, the kind of sky that usually made travelers pause and take pictures. Today, nobody was looking out the windows. They were looking at him. They were looking at the officer. They were looking at a moment that had stripped away the comfort of pretending bias only lived in obvious places. A senior airport operations manager arrived within a minute, followed by another security officer whose expression changed the instant Rachel explained what had happened. Procedures were mentioned. Verification logs were pulled. Questions came quickly now, not the careless questions Marcus had faced at the beginning, but the urgent kind institutions ask only after a mistake has become impossible to hide. Yet Marcus knew this rhythm too. First the humiliation, then the paperwork. First the public suspicion, then the private scramble to contain it. He had seen systems move faster to protect themselves than they ever moved to protect the people they had harmed. "Remove them," the senior manager said quietly, nodding toward Marcus's wrists. The words landed strangely. Not because Marcus had forgotten the restraints were there, but because the order came with the same detached efficiency that had brought them out in the first place. One command to restrict a man, another command to restore him, as if dignity could be taken and returned like airport property. Derek hesitated before stepping forward. His hand hovered for the briefest second, and Marcus could feel the officer's discomfort now, sharp and exposed. But the discomfort did not belong to Marcus. It belonged to the man who had mistaken bias for instinct and public embarrassment for security work. When the restraints were finally removed, Marcus lowered his hands slowly and rubbed one wrist with the other, not dramatically, not for effect, just enough to remind himself that his body was his own again. A woman near the gate desk wiped at her eyes. A young man in a college sweatshirt lowered his phone and shook his head like he still could not believe how fast everything had spiraled. The businessman started to move toward Marcus, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but one look from Rachel stopped him cold. Some words arrived too late to deserve air. Marcus reached down, lifted his carry-on, and pulled the folded memorial card from his jacket pocket with his free hand. For a moment, he looked at the name printed on it, a friend who had served beside him, a man who had worn the same flag on his shoulder and died believing home was something sacred. Marcus swallowed hard. He had crossed oceans for that country. He had trusted men in uniform with his life. And still, here in a domestic terminal with boarding groups about to be called, He had been reduced in seconds to a suspicion someone else found convenient. Rachel looked at him again, more shaken now than formal. "Mr. Reed," she said, "our legal and executive teams will need to speak with you." Marcus lifted his eyes to hers, calm but no longer gentle. "They can speak," he said, "but first they are going to listen." They moved Marcus to a private conference room just off the concourse, a windowed space meant for delayed passengers and tense conversations that airlines preferred to keep away from the public eye. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, and through the glass walls he could still see the terminal moving on without him, families shuffling toward gates, rolling bags cutting across the polished floor, the whole country in motion, while his own evening had been forced into a standstill by someone else's fear. Rachel Bennett entered first, followed by the senior airport operations manager, a man named Colin Mercer, whose tailored suit and careful tone suggested years of experience in saying the right thing after the wrong thing had already happened. Derek Lawson did not come in immediately. He lingered outside the glass, speaking in tight, clipped bursts into a shoulder radio, shoulders tense, jaw locked, as if procedure could still rescue pride. Marcus sat at the end of the table with his carry-on upright beside his chair and the memorial card laid flat before him. He had not missed many flights in his life. He had missed birthdays, holidays, funerals, anniversaries, and ordinary Saturdays that never came back. But this trip mattered. It was not tourism. It was not business. It was not convenience. It was a promise. Colin folded his hands and began with the polished language institutions reach for when they are already thinking about exposure. "Mr. Reed, first let me say that we regret the distress caused by the incident at the gate." Marcus did not blink. "Distress," he repeated, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to make the word sound as hollow as it was. Colin shifted in his seat. Rachel looked down. "You were publicly restrained without verified cause," Marcus said. "You treated me like a threat before you treated me like a passenger. That was not distress. That was humiliation." The room fell quiet again. Not hostile this time. Honest. Rachel spoke next, her voice steadier than before. "He is right. It was a small sentence, but it changed the room. Because once truth is spoken plainly, every softer synonym starts to sound like cowardice." Colin inhaled, nodded once, and set a thin folder on the table. "We are preserving surveillance footage and body camera material," he said. "Corporate security and legal have already been notified. We want to understand exactly what happened." Marcus leaned back slightly and looked at him with the same calm he had held all day. "No," he said. "You want to understand how visible it became." Colin did not answer. He did not need to. The phones at Gate C-18 had already done what institutions feared most. They had turned a private prejudice into public evidence. Marcus could still hear that child's voice in his head, still see strangers lifting their cameras, still feel the way 100 people had looked at him before anyone looked for facts. He rested one hand on the memorial card and thought of the man whose name was printed there, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes, a teammate he had served beside on nights when silence meant survival and trust meant everything. Daniel had once told him that the hardest thing about coming home was realizing how often honor was spoken about by people who had never been forced to prove they had any. Marcus had laughed then. It did not feel funny now. Outside the glass wall, Derek finally stepped inside. He did not sit. He remained standing near the door, his posture no longer sharp with authority, but stiff with something far less comfortable. Shame, maybe, or the first thin crack in a worldview that had protected him for years. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said, each word sounding unfamiliar in his own mouth. "I made a judgment call." Marcus lifted his eyes slowly. "That is exactly the problem," he said. "You made a judgment before you made a check." The words landed harder than Derek expected, not because Marcus raised his voice, but because he did not. There was no anger spilling across the room, no dramatic outburst to hide behind, no scene Derek could point to later and call hostile. There was only the truth, spoken with the kind of control that made everyone else feel suddenly less composed. Derek stood near the door with one hand resting against his duty belt, not out of authority anymore, but habit, the reflex of a man who had built his identity around always being the one in command. Now that command was gone, and what remained looked thin. Colin Mercer shifted the folder on the table and glanced at Rachel before speaking. "Officer Lawson, for the record, Walk us through your decision point by point. Derek swallowed once. A passenger reported a missing bag. Mr. Reed was standing nearby. He appeared tense. He gave limited answers. I took precautionary action. Rachel's head turned sharply at the phrase limited answers, and Marcus almost smiled at the familiar way language tried to clean up what fear had dirted. I answered every question you asked, Marcus said. You just decided my calm was suspicious because it came from me. Derek looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment the room could see the struggle on his face. Not the struggle of a man trying to remember events. The struggle of a man hearing his own actions translated into plain English and not liking what they revealed. Colin opened the folder and began reading from preliminary notes. Video confirms Mr. Reed handed over identification immediately. Video confirms no attempt to flee, no raised voice, no physical resistance, and no refusal to comply. Video also confirms the reporting passenger's bag was later found beneath an adjacent seat. The silence after that was almost surgical, clean, precise, deadly in its clarity. Derek's jaw tightened. I had to make a fast call. No, Marcus said, and this time his voice carried a deeper weight, something older than frustration. You made an easy call. Fast would have been checking the area before turning me into a public warning. He let the words settle, then continued. Do you know what the difference is between pressure and prejudice, Officer Lawson? Pressure comes from the situation. Prejudice comes from what you carry into it before it starts. Rachel inhaled sharply. Colin looked down at the table. Even Derek seemed to understand that no policy language in the world could soften a sentence like that. Outside the conference room, the terminal lights were beginning to dim into evening mode, and through the glass Marcus could see the long reflection of travelers moving past like a river of disconnected lives. He wondered how many of them had already uploaded the video. How many had watched without speaking? How many would go home and tell the story as if the most shocking part were that he had been someone important? That was always the part the country liked best. The reveal, the rank, the clearance, the proof that the person humiliated had status. But Marcus knew the deeper wound was simpler than that. He should have been safe from humiliation even if he had been a schoolteacher, a mechanic, a church usher, or a tired son flying home to see his mother. Human dignity was not supposed to require decoration. He placed 2 fingers on the memorial card again and thought of Daniel Hayes, of salt air and dark water, and the quiet bond forged between men who trusted each other when nothing else was certain. Daniel had been white. Marcus had been black. Out there, none of that erased reality, but it did not dictate worth either. Mission first. Truth first. Team first. Home was supposed to understand that better than anyone. Instead, here he was, explaining humanity to people who had mistaken procedure for virtue. Colin finally spoke, voice lower now, less corporate, more human. Mr. Reed, I know this does not undo what happened, but I need you to understand we are taking this seriously. Marcus looked at him without blinking. Then do not start by taking me seriously, he said. Start by taking the next ordinary black traveler seriously before you decide he looks like trouble. The room stayed still after Marcus spoke, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of people being forced to confront what they would rather file away as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Colin Mercer removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, no longer looking like a polished executive managing an incident, but a man realizing that policy manuals had very little power against moral failure once it had been witnessed in public. Rachel Bennett stood near the window with her arms folded, eyes fixed on the concourse beyond the glass where boarding had already begun for flights Marcus would not make. Somewhere out there, families were hugging goodbye, gate agents were scanning passes, and airplanes were lifting into the evening sky one after another, carrying strangers to weddings, conferences, funerals, first dates, and second chances. But Marcus remained in that room because one officer had mistaken suspicion for skill, and one accusation had been allowed to outweigh a man's dignity. Derek Lawson finally pulled out a chair and sat down, though he did it stiffly, like surrender was a language his body had never practiced. For the first time since the confrontation began, he did not sound defensive when he spoke. He sounded tired. You were saying I saw what I expected to see, he said. Marcus met his gaze. I am saying you saw what made your job feel simple. Derek looked down at the table. It was such a small movement, but everyone in the room felt the shift. The myth of certainty was beginning to crack. Rachel turned from the window and placed both hands on the back of a chair. "This is bigger than one mistake," she said quietly. "We all felt it out there. The speed, the assumption, the fact that nobody asked enough before everything escalated." She did not say the word race right away, perhaps because saying it plainly would remove the last shelter from everyone still trying to stand beneath procedure. But the word was already in the room, whether anyone welcomed it or not. Marcus looked from Rachel to Colin, then to Derek. "You want to know what people like me learn early?" he asked. "We learn that being calm will be called cold. Being clear will be called defiant. Being present in the wrong place at the wrong time will be called suspicious even when the place is public and the time is ordinary. We learn that if someone important does not interrupt the story fast enough, the story writes itself over our names." No one interrupted him. No one could. He had earned that silence with truth. Outside, a maintenance cart beeped as it backed down the corridor, and the sound seemed strangely loud in the pause that followed. Marcus thought again of Daniel Hayes and the ceremony waiting for him in California, a room filled with old teammates, service ribbons, sea stories, and the kind of grief men often carried without display. Daniel's widow would be there. So would his son, now old enough to ask harder questions about sacrifice. Marcus had promised he would stand in that room and tell the boy who his father had been when nobody was watching. Reliable, funny, brave without performance. Now he might miss that chance because an airport had confused control with judgment. Colin straightened the papers in front of him, but when he spoke, he left the papers untouched. "Mr. Reed, I cannot change what happened at that gate, but I can decide what happens next." Marcus listened without expression. Colin continued, voice more deliberate now. "I am placing an immediate hold on internal review closure. This will not be treated as a customer service issue. It will be treated as a rights and conduct issue. We will preserve every frame, every radio call, every witness statement, and every system log connected to this event." Derek lifted his head slowly. Rachel exhaled. It was the first sentence in that room that sounded less like damage control and more like consequence. Marcus nodded once, but there was no satisfaction in it. "Good," he said, "because if this ends with an apology and a memo, then all you have done is teach the next officer how to hide it better." By the time Marcus finally left the conference room, the terminal no longer felt like the same place. News of what had happened had moved faster than any official statement could. Travelers who had only caught fragments at Gate C-18 were now scrolling through fresh uploads, replaying shaky videos with captions written in anger and disbelief. Faces turned as Marcus walked past, but the stares had changed. Earlier, people had looked at him the way crowds look at someone already judged. Now they looked at him the way people look at a truth they were not prepared to witness so closely. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others offered brief nods, the quiet kind strangers give when they know words are too small. Rachel walked beside him through the concourse, not as an escort, but as someone trying, in the only way left, to show that at least one person inside the system understood the weight of what had happened. His original flight to San Diego was gone. The gate screen that had once displayed boarding groups now read "Departed" in flat white letters, as indifferent as every other machine in the building. That single word hit harder than Marcus expected. Departed. As if the evening itself had moved on without him. As if promises could simply be rescheduled. Rachel had already made calls, working phones, pulling favors, checking routes through Dallas and Phoenix, trying to get him west before midnight. But nothing direct remained. Every path now involved delays, overnights, and missed moments that could not be restored by any corporate apology. "We found a late connection that can get you there by morning," Rachel said softly. Marcus stopped beside a window overlooking the tarmac. A jet pushed back from the gate in a slow, deliberate turn, its wingtips glowing red against the deepening blue of evening. "The ceremony starts at 8, he said. "I was supposed to be there before sunrise." Rachel did not answer right away because there was no clean response to loss once it had become personal. She had seen the memorial card on the table. She knew this trip was not routine. She also knew that somewhere in a conference room behind them, senior staff were already discussing statements, exposure, counsel, optics, and all the other words institutions use when a human wrong threatens to become a legal one. Marcus slipped the card from his jacket again and ran his thumb along its edge. "Daniel Hayes, 20 years of service. Beloved husband, father, Teammate. The black print looked steady beneath the terminal lights, but Marcus's chest tightened in a way he refused to show. He had spent years training himself to remain composed under pressure. But grief had its own weather, and tonight it was mixing with something heavier than anger. Not rage, not even revenge. Disappointment. The kind that sits in the bones when the country you served keeps asking for proof that you belong inside it. Behind them, footsteps approached quickly. Colin Mercer caught up with them, slightly out of breath, his phone still in his hand. "Mr. Reed," he said, "corporate leadership has authorized immediate accommodations, rebooking, private ground transfer if needed, and full support for any memorial expenses tied to the delay." Marcus turned slowly. "Support," he repeated. "That is what this becomes now." Colin held his gaze. To his credit, he did not retreat into polished language this time. "No," he said. "This becomes accountability. Support is only the first thing we owe." For the first time that evening, Marcus heard something in the man's voice that sounded less like management and more like conscience. Rachel looked between them, waiting. Travelers continued to stream by, some pretending not to listen, others plainly doing exactly that. The airport was still a machine, still humming, still moving bodies and schedules through metal and glass. But inside that motion, something had cracked open. Not enough to heal anything, just enough to reveal what had long been there. Marcus looked out at the runway lights stretching into the dark like a line of quiet witnesses. "Then listen carefully," he said. "What happened to me did not begin when that officer touched my wrist. It began the moment everybody around him accepted that I looked like the easiest answer." The word stayed with Colin long after Marcus finished speaking. You could see it in the way the man no longer reached for polished language, no longer tried to soften the edges of what had happened with careful corporate phrasing. The airport around them kept moving, but that small space by the window had become something else entirely, a place where truth had finally outrun procedure. Rachel stood a few feet away with her tablet lowered at her side, listening the way people listen when they understand that this is no longer about resolving a complaint, but about facing a failure that had always been there waiting for the right moment to expose itself. Marcus remained still, his carry-on beside him, the memorial card in his hand, the evening light reflecting faintly across the glass behind him. He looked tired now, not in the ordinary way travelers get tired after delays and crowded gates, but in the deeper way a person looks when forced to carry both grief and dignity at the same time. Colin nodded once and said, very quietly, "You are right. It was not dramatic. It was not enough. But it was real." Within the hour, the Airport Police Division placed Derek Lawson on immediate administrative leave pending formal review. The airline preserved every second of surveillance footage, every internal message, every witness statement, every system timestamp connected to the incident. By midnight, the video had spread far beyond the terminal, across local news stations, veteran groups, civil rights advocates, travel forums, and national commentators who saw in those few minutes what Marcus had tried to explain in that room, that the harm was not just in the public restraint itself, but in how easily a crowd, an officer, and an institution had accepted the idea that a black man standing near a gate could be the simplest answer to someone else's fear. Marcus reached San Diego the next morning on the first available flight, long after the private sunrise gathering had already ended. He made it in time for the larger memorial service, where Daniel Hayes's widow embraced him without a word and Daniel's son, now 14, looked up at him with the serious eyes of a boy learning too early what service can cost. When Marcus spoke that morning, he did not mention the airport at first. He spoke about Daniel the way he had promised he would. He talked about discipline, humor, loyalty, and the quiet courage of men who did not need applause to do what was right. Only later, standing outside beneath the California sun with a few old teammates around him, did he tell them what had delayed him. No one interrupted. No one looked surprised. That, in its own way, was part of the tragedy. In the months that followed, Marcus refused to let the story shrink into a headline and then disappear. He filed a civil rights claim. He met with attorneys, investigators, veterans groups, and airline leadership. He insisted that any resolution include more than money. Training had to change. Review standards had to change. Response protocols had to change. Public apologies without structural reform, he said, were just another way powerful systems rehearsed regret while protecting the habits that caused harm in the first place. The final settlement came almost a year later. The airline and airport authority agreed to pay Marcus Reed $2.5 million, but the number was never the heart of the story. The real impact came in the changes attached to it: mandatory bias and de-escalation training for airport police and supervisory airline staff, independent review of public restraint incidents, expanded passenger rights reporting, and a written acknowledgement that Marcus had been wrongfully singled out and publicly humiliated without verified cause. Derek Lawson resigned before the disciplinary process fully concluded. Rachel Bennett remained with the airline and became one of the internal voices pushing hardest for reform. Colin Mercer, to his credit, returned to that conference room transcript more than once in the months that followed, because some sentences are too costly to forget. And Marcus, when asked later by a reporter what hurt most, did not say the delay, the videos, or even the humiliation. He said, "The hardest part was knowing that if the system had not recognized my record, too many people would have been comfortable leaving me inside their mistake." That was the echo the story left behind. Not that a decorated man had been underestimated. Not that money changed hands in the end. But that respect should never have needed proof, and dignity should never depend on rank. He had served his country in places where danger was obvious. What nearly broke his faith was how ordinary prejudice could look at home. The badge gave one man authority for a moment. The truth gave Marcus back something far greater. It gave the room no place left to hide.